The dense Philippine jungle rustled with an unfamiliar presence in February 1974. A young Japanese college student named Norio Suzuki had ventured deep into the wilderness of Lubang Island with an unusual mission, one that most people thought was impossible, even insane. He was searching for three things, as he told his friends before leaving: a panda, the abominable snowman, and Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a Japanese soldier who supposedly still believed World War II was raging on, nearly 3 decades after it had ended. While the first two seemed like whimsical fantasies, the third was about to become shockingly real. What Suzuki found in those tangled vines and shadowy groves would stun the entire world. A man emerged from the foliage, rifle in hand, uniform tattered but still worn with military precision. His face was weathered by sun and time, his eyes sharp and suspicious. This wasn't a hermit who had simply lost his way. This was a soldier still at war, still following orders given to him 29 years earlier, still fighting an enemy that had long since become an ally. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, intelligence officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, had refused to believe that his country had surrendered. And he had very good reasons for that refusal, reasons rooted in training so intense, in loyalty so absolute, that it had transformed him into something between a ghost and a legend. The story of Hiroo Onoda doesn't begin in 1974, or even in 1945 when the war officially ended. It begins in the shadowy halls of Japan's Nakano school, an elite training facility where ordinary soldiers were transformed into something far more dangerous. Onoda had been selected for guerrilla warfare training, a program that emphasized survival, sabotage, and psychological warfare. But there was something else drilled into these young men, something that would prove both their greatest strength and their most profound curse: never surrender. The instructors at Nakano School had hammered this principle into their students with an intensity that bordered on religious fervor. Surrender was not just forbidden, it was literally unthinkable. Death was preferable to the shame of giving up, and if that meant fighting alone, fighting forever, then so be it. In December 1944, Onoda received his orders. He was to go to Lubang Island in the Philippines and conduct guerrilla warfare against Allied forces. His mission was clear: disrupt enemy operations, destroy infrastructure, and under no circumstances was he to surrender or take his own life. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, had looked him directly in the eye and delivered a command that would echo through decades. "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you." Those words became Onoda's anchor, his reason for continuing when every logical voice should have told him to stop. The major had promised to return, and a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army did not doubt his superior officer. Ever. When Onoda arrived on Lubang Island, he was part of a small group of soldiers tasked with defending the strategic location. But the war was already turning against Japan. The overwhelming force of the Allied advance was crushing Japanese positions throughout the Pacific. By February 1945, American forces had landed on Lubang, and what remained of the Japanese garrison was quickly overwhelmed. Most soldiers died in battle or surrendered, but Onoda, along with 3 other men, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kenshichi Kozuka, refused to give up. They melted into the jungle, becoming shadows, beginning a war that would last longer than most people's entire military careers. The 4 men established a guerrilla existence that was equal parts military operation and survival nightmare. They moved constantly, never staying in one location long enough to establish a pattern. They raided local farms for food, stealing rice, bananas, and coconuts under the cover of darkness. They maintained their rifles and ammunition with obsessive care, knowing that their weapons might be all that stood between them and capture. And they watched. They watched the island change, watched as people came and went, watched as the world around them transformed in ways they couldn't understand. But they interpreted everything through the lens of war. When they saw locals in different clothes, they assumed it was American propaganda. When they found leaflets announcing Japan's surrender, they were certain it was a trick, a psychological warfare tactic designed to lure them out of hiding. The first crack in their group came in 1949, just 4 years into their extended campaign. Private Akatsu, perhaps the most psychologically fragile of the group, couldn't take it anymore. The isolation, the constant fear, the grinding tedium broken only by moments of terror. It became too much. One night, he simply left, slipping away from the others and eventually surrendering to Philippine authorities. Onoda and the remaining 2 soldiers were shaken but not deterred. They told themselves that Akatsu had been weak, that he had failed in his duty. They would not make the same mistake. They would continue to fight, continue to believe, continue to wait for Japan to return for them. The years stretched on with agonizing slowness. 1950 became 1954, and still they persisted. They developed an almost supernatural ability to avoid detection, moving through the jungle like spirits. The local Filipino population began to tell stories about the mountain devils, Japanese soldiers who appeared without warning to steal food or supplies before vanishing again into the wilderness. Several times, Philippine military forces launched operations to find them, but Onoda and his men always seemed to be one step ahead. They had turned Lubang Island into their personal battlefield, knowing every trail, every water source, every hiding place. The island had become their entire universe, and they were its unseen masters. But the jungle was taking its toll in ways they couldn't fully acknowledge. Malnutrition left them gaunt and weakened. Tropical diseases came and went, fevers that should have killed them but somehow didn't. Their uniforms rotted away and were replaced by crude garments made from stolen cloth. Their boots disintegrated, replaced by sandals fashioned from tree bark. Yet they maintained their military bearing, their sense of purpose. They conducted reconnaissance patrols, gathered intelligence on the enemy, planned operations that would never come to fruition. It was a war fought in their minds as much as in the physical world, a conflict sustained by belief alone. In May 1954, nearly a decade after the war's end, tragedy struck. Corporal Shimada was shot and killed in a confrontation with a Philippine search party. For Onoda and Kozuka, it was a devastating loss. They had been 3 brothers in arms, bound by shared experience and unshakable loyalty. Now they were 2. The jungle suddenly seemed larger, emptier, more hostile. But still they continued. Shimada's death only reinforced their conviction that the war was real, that the danger was genuine. If the Philippines was truly at peace, why were armed men hunting them? Why the constant patrols? To their minds, it was proof that the conflict continued, that their mission remained valid. Onoda and Kozuka settled into a rhythm that would last for another 18 years. Just 2 men against the world. They became even more cautious, even more skilled at evasion. They burned rice stores they believed were meant for enemy troops. They exchanged gunfire with search parties. In their minds, they were still disrupting enemy operations, still fulfilling their mission. The Philippine government made repeated attempts to convince them that the war was over. Loudspeakers were set up in the jungle, broadcasting messages in Japanese. Family members were brought to the island to call out to them. Letters and photographs were left at known camping sites. But Onoda and Kozuka dismissed it all as enemy propaganda, elaborate deceptions designed to trick them into surrendering. The world outside Lubang Island had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to them. Japan had rebuilt from the ashes of defeat, transforming into an economic powerhouse. The Philippines had gained independence and was forging its own path. The Cold War had replaced World War II as the defining global conflict. Men had walked on the moon. Technology had advanced at an incredible pace. But in the green shadows of Lubang's jungle, time seemed frozen in 1945. Onoda and Kozuka lived in a bubble of their own creation, sustained by training, loyalty, and an inability to accept that everything they had believed in had ended in defeat. October 1972 brought another crushing blow. After 27 years of hiding, fighting, and surviving together, Private First Class Kozuka was killed in a confrontation with Philippine police. Onoda was suddenly, terrifyingly alone. He had spent more than half his life on this island, fighting this endless war, and now he was the last one left. Most men would have broken at this point. The isolation, the loss, the sheer absurdity of continuing alone. It should have been the end. But Onoda was not most men. The training he had received at Nakano school, the orders he had been given, the promise that Japan would return for him, these things remained as solid and real to him as the rifle in his hands. If anything, Kozuka's death made him more determined. His friend had died fighting. To surrender now would be to betray that sacrifice. For the next 15 months, Hiroo Onoda became a ghost story made flesh. Alone in the jungle, he continued his one-man war with meticulous dedication. He maintained his rifle, kept his uniform as neat as possible, conducted reconnaissance missions as if reporting to some invisible headquarters. He was 50 years old, his body worn down by decades of hardship, yet he moved through the jungle with the efficiency of a much younger man. The Philippine authorities had largely given up on finding him. He had become a legend, a curiosity, the soldier who wouldn't stop fighting. Some people doubted he even existed anymore. Perhaps he had died years ago, and the occasional sightings were just local myths, stories told to frighten children or entertain tourists. Then came Norio Suzuki, the adventurous college student with his absurd quest to find a panda, the Yeti, and Hiroo Onoda. In February 1974, Suzuki did what the Philippine military, various search parties, and countless well-meaning attempts had failed to do. He found Lieutenant Onoda. But Suzuki's success came from an unconventional approach. He didn't hunt Onoda like an enemy or try to trick him into surrendering. Instead, Suzuki wandered the jungle openly, almost carelessly, making no attempt at stealth. He left notes at various locations explaining that he was looking for Onoda not to capture him, but simply to talk. It was such an unusual tactic that Onoda's curiosity was piqued. When they finally met face to face, the encounter was surreal. Onoda, still armed and cautious, emerged from the jungle to confront this strange young Japanese man who claimed to have come looking for him. Suzuki spoke to him in Japanese, treating him with respect as a soldier rather than as a curiosity or a madman. They talked for hours, and Suzuki explained that the war had indeed ended, that Japan had surrendered in 1945, that the world had moved on. But Onoda, while impressed by Suzuki's sincerity, couldn't simply accept this at face value. He had been trained too well, had maintained his discipline for too long. He told Suzuki that he would only surrender if he received a direct order from his commanding officer. It seemed like an impossible condition. After all, nearly 30 years had passed. His commanding officer could be dead, retired, untraceable. But Suzuki took the challenge seriously. He returned to Japan and began an exhaustive search for Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his original orders back in 1944. Against all odds, Suzuki found him. Taniguchi was alive, now a bookseller living a quiet civilian life. When told that his former subordinate was still on Lubang Island, still fighting, still waiting for orders, Taniguchi was stunned. The war had been over for 3 decades. How could this be possible? But he understood the power of the training Onoda had received, the absolute nature of the orders he had given. If Onoda was truly still there, still following those 30-year-old commands, then Taniguchi had a responsibility to finish what he had started. On March 9, 1974, an extraordinary scene unfolded on Lubang Island. Major Taniguchi, now significantly older and dressed in civilian clothes, was brought to a predetermined location in the jungle. Hiroo Onoda, dressed in his handmade uniform, rifle still at his side, emerged from the trees. It was a meeting between 2 men separated by 3 decades, 2 men from a world that no longer existed. Taniguchi stood before his former subordinate and read a formal order. Onoda's mission was complete. The Imperial Japanese Army no longer required his services. He was ordered to cease all combat operations and surrender his weapons. For Onoda, hearing these words from his actual commanding officer was like a key turning in a lock. The spell that had sustained him for 29 years was finally broken. Hiroo Onoda's surrender was a media sensation that captured global attention. Here was a man who had fought a war single-handedly for nearly 3 decades, who had survived incredible hardship through sheer discipline and will. Cameras captured him as he formally presented his rifle, still in working order, along with his sword, ammunition, and hand grenades. He stood at attention in his ragged uniform, saluting as he completed his final act as a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army. There was something both tragic and magnificent about the moment. A man finally released from a duty that had consumed his entire adult life. The aftermath was complicated. Onoda had killed approximately 30 people over the years in his guerrilla activities, believing he was fighting enemy soldiers and collaborators. The Philippine government, recognizing the unique circumstances, granted him a pardon. President Ferdinand Marcos understood that Onoda had genuinely believed he was at war, that he had been following orders given to him in good faith. Prosecuting him would serve no purpose other than vengeance. Onoda returned to Japan as a celebrity, a man out of time, a living relic of a war that had ended before many of his admirers were even born. But adjustment to the modern world was profoundly difficult. Japan had changed beyond recognition. The nation he had fought for, the empire that had commanded his absolute loyalty, no longer existed. In its place was a prosperous, peaceful democracy. The values he had been taught, the warrior code, the emphasis on honor and sacrifice, seemed quaint and outdated to many young Japanese. He was treated as a curiosity, interviewed endlessly, asked the same questions over and over. Why didn't you surrender? How did you survive? What did you think about? The attention was suffocating. He had spent nearly 3 decades in solitude, and now he was surrounded by crowds, cameras, questions he couldn't adequately answer because the people asking them couldn't understand the world he had inhabited. In 1975, just a year after his surrender, Onoda left Japan for Brazil, where he established a cattle ranch. The open spaces and simpler lifestyle offered him something closer to the peace he sought. He married, built a life far removed from the media circus. But the jungle had marked him permanently. The man who emerged from Lubang Island wasn't the same person who had entered it in 1944. He had been transformed by his experience, shaped by isolation and absolute commitment to duty. In later years, he wrote a memoir and occasionally returned to Japan to speak to young people about survival, dedication, and the importance of following through on commitments. He even returned to Lubang Island in 1996, donating money to a local school as a gesture of reconciliation. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014 at the age of 91, having lived long enough to see the world change multiple times over. His story raises uncomfortable questions about loyalty, duty, and the power of belief. Was he a hero, maintaining his commitment against impossible odds? Or was he a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute obedience, of training so thorough that it prevents rational thinking? The answer, like most truths, exists somewhere in between. Onoda was a product of his time and training, a man who took his duty seriously to an extent that modern people find almost incomprehensible. What makes Onoda's story particularly fascinating is what it reveals about human psychology and the power of cognitive frameworks. He wasn't insane or delusional in the clinical sense. He was operating from a completely coherent worldview, one where his orders were legitimate, his mission was real, and the evidence of peace around him was enemy deception. Every piece of contradictory evidence, the leaflets, the photographs, the loudspeaker messages, was interpreted through this framework and discarded as propaganda. It's a stark reminder of how our beliefs shape our perception of reality, how training and conviction can override even overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The Philippine locals who encountered Onoda over the years had mixed feelings about him. To some, he was a dangerous remnant of occupation, a man whose presence brought fear and occasional violence. To others, particularly in later years, he became an almost mythical figure, a testament to human endurance. The fact that he survived for 3 decades in the jungle, evading capture, maintaining his mental faculties, and staying true to his mission, commanded a certain respect even from those who had suffered because of his actions. Onoda's fellow holdouts who died before him, Akatsu, Shimada, and Kozuka, remain tragic figures in this story. They shared his conviction but didn't live to see resolution. Kozuka, in particular, had spent 27 years in the jungle with Onoda, an almost unimaginable length of time to maintain such an existence. Their deaths in service of a war that had long ended underscores the human cost of Onoda's unwavering belief. He survived, but at what cost to others? The psychological dimensions of Onoda's experience continue to fascinate researchers. How did he maintain his mental health during decades of isolation? What cognitive strategies did he employ to cope with the grinding monotony and constant danger? How did he process grief when his companions died? These questions point to remarkable resilience but also to the darker aspects of conditioning and ideology. The Nakano school had created a weapon, a human being so thoroughly programmed that even decades of contradictory evidence couldn't break through his operational framework. Modern military training has moved away from the kind of absolute obedience that characterized Onoda's education. There's greater emphasis on critical thinking, on the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, on recognizing when orders are no longer valid or when situations have fundamentally changed. Onoda's story serves as a case study in military academies around the world, an example of both incredible dedication and the dangers of training that doesn't account for radical change in context. The technological gap between Onoda's entry into the jungle in 1944 and his emergence in 1974 was staggering. He went in during the age of propeller aircraft and emerged into a world of jet planes, computers, and satellite communications. The Japan he left was an empire at war. The Japan he returned to was a pacifist democracy and economic superpower. Imagine trying to process that level of change all at once, after decades of living in a mental and physical environment frozen in time. It's no wonder he struggled to adjust. No wonder he eventually sought refuge in the relative simplicity of a Brazilian cattle ranch. There's something profoundly lonely about Onoda's story, especially those final 15 months after Kozuka's death when he was completely alone. Most people never experience true isolation. There's almost always someone, some connection to other human beings. But Onoda spent over a year with no human contact whatsoever, speaking to no one, seeing no friendly faces, existing in a bubble of his own consciousness. How did he maintain his sanity? How did he avoid simply giving up? The answer seems to lie in routine, in the military discipline that structured every day, in the mission that gave meaning to his existence. Without that framework, the isolation might have been unbearable. The reunion between Onoda and Major Taniguchi deserves deeper reflection. Imagine being Taniguchi, living a quiet life as a bookseller, suddenly confronted with the fact that orders you gave 30 years ago were still being followed. The guilt, the responsibility, the sheer unreality of it must have been overwhelming. Yet he stepped up, traveled to the Philippines, and released Onoda from his duty. It was an act of compassion and responsibility, closing a loop that had remained open for 3 decades. Onoda's pardon by President Marcos was politically astute but also genuinely humane. Prosecuting him would have served no real purpose and would have punished a man for following orders he genuinely believed were legitimate. The families of those killed by Onoda over the years had more complicated feelings, understandably. But even they seemed to recognize that this was an extraordinary situation, that Onoda wasn't a criminal in any conventional sense but rather a man caught in circumstances beyond his control or comprehension. The media frenzy that greeted Onoda's surrender reveals our fascination with extreme human experiences. Here was a man who had lived a life utterly unlike anything most people could imagine. He became a mirror in which people could examine their own concepts of duty, loyalty, and perseverance. Some saw him as inspirational, others as misguided. Both perspectives had validity. He was inspirational in his ability to survive and maintain his principles under incredible hardship. He was misguided in his inability to recognize when those principles no longer applied to reality. The ranch in Brazil represented Onoda's attempt to find a life that made sense to him. The vast, open spaces were nothing like the claustrophobic jungle, yet they offered a similar kind of freedom from the complexities of modern urban life. He could work with his hands, maintain routines, live simply. It was as close as he could come to replicating the clarity of purpose he had felt during his 30 years of solitude. When Onoda returned to Lubang Island in 1996, it must have been an emotionally complex experience. The jungle that had been his home, his battlefield, his prison for so long had changed. The island had developed, the people had moved on, the physical landscape itself had altered. Yet some things would have been familiar, certain trees, particular rock formations, the sound of the wind through the palms. By donating to the local school, he was attempting to make amends, to transform his legacy from one of conflict to one of contribution. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda's story ultimately transcends the specifics of World War II or the Philippine jungle. It's a story about what happens when belief becomes absolute, when duty overrides all other considerations, when a human being commits so completely to a cause that nothing can shake that commitment. It's inspirational and cautionary in equal measure. We can admire his survival skills, his discipline, his unwavering dedication, while simultaneously recognizing the tragedy of a life spent fighting a war that had ended, of opportunities lost, of years that can never be recovered. In the end, Hiroo Onoda was a soldier who kept his promise, who followed his orders to the very letter, who never surrendered until properly relieved of duty. Whether that makes him a hero or a victim depends on your perspective, but it undeniably makes him one of the most extraordinary individuals of the 20th century.